At the special company party, when a strange man pulled my wife aside and kissed her right in front of me, I didn't scream, I didn't react, I didn't fight. I just walked toward them, my heart silent, my gaze firm, my breath long and heavy. I handed her the ring and said, "You can continue, it's over here for me," and that was it. I walked away amidst colored lights, raised glasses, and false smiles, with the strange certainty that this was the end of a story that only I still respected. A story that, for a long time, I carried alone, while it had already faded away, perhaps months ago, perhaps years ago, perhaps since the day I stopped noticing the signs, or pretending not to see them. It hurts, but it's true, sometimes we're the last to realize we're already being betrayed. The last to accept that a bond has been broken. The last to believe that love still lives where only ruins remain. I didn't make a fuss, I didn't cause a commotion, because there was nothing left to save there. The damage was already done, and it wasn't just the kiss. It was everything it represented. It was a public betrayal, yes, but only because she'd already betrayed me in silence 1,000 times before. In her tired gaze. In her absent body. In her cold smile. In her automatic touch. In her rush to sleep. In her contempt disguised as routine. She tried to justify herself days later. She came to me with puffy eyes and a shaky voice, saying it meant nothing, that it was an impulse, a spur-of-the-moment mistake, a meaningless kiss. That she didn't even know the guy well, that he had disappeared, vanished, that she didn't even have his number. And there, once again, she lied. It didn't matter if the man was known or not, what tore me apart wasn't his identity, but her decision. She chose. In the middle of a party. Before my eyes. With a dress I'd complimented before we left the house. With makeup I'd waited an hour for her to finish. With the glass of wine I'd poured myself. She chose to leave me alone even though she was right next to me. What hurt the most was realizing I still loved her in that moment. Even after the kiss, even after the silence, even after her cowardice in looking at me as if nothing had happened. I loved her. And that's why I left. Because love is also knowing how to leave when the other person doesn't know how to stay. When the other person chooses to hurt you even though they could protect you. Those were difficult days. No sleep. No hunger. No direction. My head was spinning around the damned question, why, and no answer was enough. Until I stopped looking. Because understanding betrayal doesn't erase the pain. It only makes it clearer. And sometimes, we just need to accept that we'll never fully understand why someone who swore to love you chose to destroy you. Over time, life began to return. Little by little. A hot, flavorful coffee. A long, tear-free bath. A hearty laugh with an old friend. A song on the radio that no longer hurts. And then, an unexpected message. A light conversation. A fresh look. A sincere hug. And something I thought impossible blossomed again, trust. Not in her. But in love. In another love. In someone who values loyalty. Who builds in peace. Who listens with their whole body. Who doesn't make me compete for attention. Someone who looks at me as if I were enough. As if I had never stopped being. And it was then, when I was already in a different emotional place, she reappeared. She wanted to talk. To say she was sorry. That she'd made a mistake. That she regretted it. That she understood too late the value of what she'd lost. And I listened. Calmly. Because resentment weighs heavily too. And forgiving isn't forgetting, it's letting go. I did forgive. But I didn't go back. Because those who betray destroy a part of us that can't be rebuilt the same way. We can move on, but never the same. She was left with the void. I, with the serenity of someone who has learned that love cannot be begged for, forced, or negotiated. Love is lived with presence, with respect, with mutual surrender. And all of this was missing from her for me. But there was plenty of me for her. And that was what hurt me most, having given everything to someone who didn't know how to receive. Having given myself completely to someone who didn't deserve even half. Years later, by one of those coincidences life has to test us, I went to get some old books from a closet in my mother's house, where I'd left some things after the separation. I found a box of souvenirs, photos, tickets, movie tickets, letters. And at the bottom of the box, there was one that had never been delivered. A letter from her to me. She said she felt distant, invisible, disconnected. She said she needed more attention, more presence, more of us. She asked for help. She begged for a reaction. But she never gave it to me. She hid the letter. And days later, she betrayed me. That unsent letter was the final blow. Because there I understood that she tried before betraying me. But I also understood that you didn't have the courage to face me with the truth. You chose the cruelest path, betrayal instead of conversation. Abandonment instead of a proposal. And in that moment, as I read her desperate words written in a weak but heartfelt handwriting, I cried. Not because I wanted to go back. But because I realized that if she had shown me that letter, maybe the story would have been different. But it wasn't. Because time doesn't go back. And life doesn't rewrite chapters, it just moves forward. Today, I'm a different person. Someone who loves again. Who believes again. But with scars that remind me daily that love is a choice, but respect is the foundation. And without it, all love crumbles. But the strangest thing is that the man from the kiss, the one who ruined everything, never showed up again. And when, unintentionally, I learned where he came from, I discovered something that would completely change my perception of everything. Something she never knew either. Something that, to this day, I carry with me as one of life's greatest ironies. And that's where the story changes tone. Because sometimes betrayal isn't the end. It's just the beginning of a truth much greater than anyone expected. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized, quite the opposite. All the stories you'll hear are fictional, but they carry deep emotional truths. Our purpose is clear: show how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and leaves marks that time does not always erase. Each narrative is a reflection of what many have already experienced, and what others may yet avoid. Now, take a deep breath. Because what comes next is a shocking story about love, choices and consequences. Prepare yourself. His name was Michael, and hers was Emma. Two simple, everyday names, yet charged with history, with life, with promises that, for a time, seemed eternal. They met on a rainy Saturday, inside a small coffee shop, sheltered from the world and the urgencies outside. Emma was sitting by the window, scribbling thoughts in a crumpled notebook, and Michael, distracted and with his phone nearly dead, asked to sit next to her because all the tables were occupied. Conversation didn't come immediately, but it did. First with glances, then with a comment about the weather, then about the coffee, and before they knew it, they were exchanging shy laughs and sharing slices of cake. It was one of those encounters that doesn't seem important at the time, but changes everything inside. Michael was an architect, with a calm gaze and a patient way of being. He was the kind of man who spoke little but observed a lot. He had the ability to notice details others missed: the crease in Emma's sleeve, the way she wrinkled her nose when she laughed, the way she bit the cap of her pen when concentrating. He lived with a packed schedule, projects piling up and deadlines chasing him, yet he still managed to find time to write notes in the morning and make coffee for them both before leaving. Emma, on the other hand, was a literature teacher at a high school. Passionate about words, sensitive to silence, a lover of stories that didn't end with happy endings, she said those were the ones that felt most real. She had a restless heart, the kind that feels too much, dreams too big, and sometimes gets lost in its own inner labyrinths. But with Michael, she felt peace, a peace she never knew how to name, but that made her want to stay. They both had their own worlds before they met, and it was this difference in pace that made their relationship so unique. He was stability, she was intensity. He was comfortable silence, she was words that overflowed. And somehow, these differences fit together into a beautiful balance. They lived in a small but cozy apartment, decorated with plants, books, and simple travel memorabilia. There was something homey about the way they lived, even when they didn't say anything. They shared their routines naturally. Michael took care of the bills, Emma the cooking. He was good at organizing everything, she at turning any meal into a special moment. And so, the years passed with small, precious rituals. Sunday breakfast with jazz in the background. Movie nights with popcorn, lunches with her parents once a month, walks in the park when the sun allowed. Nothing grand. But everything was intense in a quiet way. Emma used to say that love lived in the details, and Michael made a point of remembering that. On special occasions, he wrote letters instead of gifts. On difficult days, he picked her up from school with simple flowers, sunflowers, her favorite. And when she questioned whether they were stagnant, whether their love would stand the test of time, he would smile and say, "We don't need to rush, just be consistent." These words always calmed her, even when something inside her begged for more. Not more love, but perhaps more movement. Not more attention, but perhaps more intensity. And yet, she stayed, because she believed that loving was also learning to slow down. They lived in a tenuous, almost imperceptible balance between comfort and restlessness. Emma, with her ever-evolving desires, her silent doubts, her inner immersions she shared with no one. Michael, with his serenity that sometimes bordered on distraction, his way of loving that was constant, but perhaps too restrained for someone like her. Still, there was a lot of affection. There was respect. There was a shared past and plans that seemed solid. They talked about children sometimes, about switching apartments, about traveling to Europe for next year's vacation. Everything seemed in place. On the surface. But inside her, something was beginning to stir. Small, almost imperceptible, like a crack only visible up close. It wasn't unhappiness. It was a kind of subtle restlessness that surfaced at random moments, when he fell asleep too quickly and didn't realize she was still awake, when he forgot to ask how the week's hardest class went, when she wanted to talk about her fears and he only offered solutions. Emma couldn't name it, but she knew there was something there that hurt, and worst of all, it hurt alone. Michael, on the other hand, seemed completely surrendered to the idea that everything was fine. He believed in their love like someone who believes in the solidity of a well-constructed building. He believed that time strengthened them, not drove them apart. And perhaps that's why he stopped looking closely. He stopped asking questions deeply. He began to trust the structure too much and forget to care for the foundation. On their anniversaries, they still made an effort. They went to their favorite restaurant, toasted with wine, exchanged smiles and gifts. But there was a hint of effort, an attempt to relive what had been spontaneous before. Emma felt this more acutely, but tried to ignore it. Not out of complacency, but out of fear of facing what it meant. There were still good days. Days when they laughed together, when they danced around the house, when they made love as if they were still newlyweds. But these moments came between long periods of too comfortable silence. Michael was the same. Attentive. Affectionate. Present. But Emma was no longer. She smiled, but she missed something she couldn't explain. She felt alone even when she was with someone. And worst of all, she felt guilty about it. She tried to compensate by dedicating herself more to work, planning projects with her students, and immersing herself in books. But all it took was a silent night in the living room, with him distracted by his laptop and her staring at her empty cup, for the restlessness to return. At some point, she began writing to herself. Loose texts, hidden confessions, unanswered questions. She didn't show them to anyone, least of all him. It was as if she'd created a secret space within herself, a place where she could be true, even if only for a few minutes a day. Michael continued to believe she was fine. And perhaps, for fear of disappointing him, she pretended to be. In the eyes of their friends, they were the perfect couple. Those who respected each other, admired each other, who lasted longer than most. And that, in a way, put even more pressure on them. When Emma tried to open up about certain more sensitive conversations, Michael thought she was overreacting. He said it was just a phase. That they were fine. That it was normal after years. And then she kept quiet. Accepted it. But the rift grew. Some days, she thought about leaving. Other days, she felt ashamed for even considering it. He was good. He loved her. She knew it. And yet, something inside her was already beginning to shut down, little by little, like a light slowly fading until the darkness becomes natural. There were no serious arguments. No shouting. No betrayal. Not yet. But what there was a silence filled with absence, an absence only she felt. And this feeling made her wonder, day after day, if love was enough. If stability was enough. If comfort could, at some point, turn into prison. Michael didn't see it. Because he loved her the way he did, and believed it was enough. Emma, for her part, was no longer sure. But she said nothing. Not yet. And it was in this scenario, of quiet love and hidden doubts, that something began to take shape on the horizon. Something not even she could have foreseen. Something that would forever change everything they had built. And that would show, with an almost cruel intensity, how sometimes love doesn't die suddenly. It fades, silently, until someone makes the mistake of trying to feel it again, somewhere else. It was a warm late afternoon, one of those that brings tiredness even before night falls, as if the air carried an invisible weight. Michael, as usual, left the office with his head full of ideas and numbers, but with a light heart. There was something satisfying about the routine for him, the predictability comforted him. The return home, the automatic gestures of taking off his shoes, greeting Emma with a kiss on the forehead, asking how her day was, and listening, even if distractedly, to her stories about her students, her books, her plans for the next school project. But that week, Emma seemed more distracted. She said she was tired, a little overwhelmed, and justified her silence with her eyes lowered and the promise that everything was fine, she just needed some time. Michael, accustomed to respecting her space, didn't insist. He thought maybe it was just the weight of the semester, or one of those cycles she experienced from time to time, and chose to give her the space she seemed to need. The following weeks dragged on. Small absences began to creep into the details. She went to bed earlier, avoided long conversations, smiled less intensely. He tried to keep the mood light, prepare dinners, suggest outings. She accepted, but always with a distant look, as if she were only physically present. She began going out more often, saying she needed time for herself, that she wanted to walk, think, breathe. She began to respond to messages more slowly, forgetting little things, trading subtle touches for quick hugs, as if avoiding depth were a form of protection. Michael noticed, but said nothing. His love was silent, and his trust in her was so solid that he refused to suspect anything. He preferred to believe it was just a phase, one of those moments when couples drift apart for a while and then reunite. After all, there were no arguments, no fights, no apparent reasons. Just distance. Emma, for her part, was plunged into an inner turmoil that was difficult to contain. The previously subtle uneasiness now took over her thoughts, her breathing, her skin. She had met someone weeks ago, by chance, at a lecture she'd attended at the invitation of a classmate. A brief, informal encounter, unplanned. But something about that man sparked a spark in her that had long been extinguished. He was a stranger with a confident demeanor, a gaze that listened intently, a tone of voice that seemed to understand her pauses. There was no intention, at least not at first. They talked, laughed, exchanged impressions about books, exchanged numbers. She hesitated before replying to the first message, but she did. She told herself it wouldn't go any further. Just a conversation outside the bubble of everyday life. Just someone new to share ideas with. But it didn't stop there. The man, whose eyes always seemed to know more than they were saying, began to become a constant presence. Messages throughout the day, comments about everything and nothing, veiled invitations that Emma initially declined but gradually began to accept. Quick dates after school, long conversations in parked cars, coffees sipped with guilt hidden behind smiles. There was no rush. Everything was built in the silence of her internal conflicts. She didn't want to cheat. She told herself so. She didn't want to hurt Michael. But she also didn't know how to escape the mess she'd gotten herself into. She felt that with that man something was rekindling inside her, something she thought was dead. She felt desired, heard, alive. And at the same time, torn apart inside. Michael remained the same. Loving, trustworthy, present. He bought tickets to a play she wanted to see, prepared a special evening with her favorite dish, and told her he missed the light-heartedness of before. Emma cried in the bathroom that night, without him seeing. She cried because she knew what was about to happen, because she knew she was crossing a line from which she could not return. But she said nothing. And the next day, she left for school early, claiming a meeting that didn't exist. She hadn't planned it. It just happened. She was with him in a discreet coffee shop, talking with her forehead resting on her hand, when the kiss came. An impulse. A quick surrender, fraught with tension and guilt. There was no passion, just the emotional release of months of pent-up emotion. And when they pulled away, Emma knew there would be no hiding it for long. That kiss was more than an act. It was the end of what she and Michael had built. Because even though Michael wasn't there, she knew she had betrayed him irrevocably. The following days were a chaotic time inside her. She didn't know whether to tell him, hide, delete the other man's number, or pretend nothing had happened. She tried to act normal, but she was in pieces inside. And then came the invitation from Michael's company, an end-of-quarter party, more social than professional, with partners, family, and colleagues. Emma hesitated, but Michael insisted, saying it would be good for them both to break out of their routine, that he missed seeing her by his side at events like this. She agreed, trying to push her feelings down, trying to pretend she could still fix everything. The party was elegant, with a sophisticated atmosphere, ambient music, glasses of wine, and fake smiles. Emma looked beautiful, wearing a dress Michael complimented as they left the house. But inside, she felt broken. The other man suddenly appeared among the guests, as if he were just another face in the crowd. She froze when she saw him. She hadn't known he would be there. She hadn't known he had any connection to Michael's world. Her heart pounded, and she tried to avoid his gaze. But he moved closer. And the gesture that followed was as quick as it was unexpected. He pulled her close, right there in the middle of the room, and kissed her. It was an instant. A single instant that changed everything. Michael saw her. He was just a few steps away, holding 2 glasses of wine. He stopped, watched, said nothing. He approached in silence. Emma felt the world collapse around her. The voices faded, the music grew distant, the air heavy. Michael reached out, placed the ring in her palm, looked into her eyes, and said, with a calmness that hurt more than any scream, "You can continue. It's over for me." And then he turned and left. She tried to pursue him. She tried to summon him, to justify, to explain the inexplicable. But no words could overcome the damage done. No speech could undo that act. His silence was the verdict. Michael was gone, and with him, he took everything they had built. Emma stood there, the cold ring in her hand, her face pale, and her conscience in tatters. But what she didn't yet know, was that there was something more. Something hidden between the lines of that story. A detail tucked away in the back of a drawer that, when revealed, would completely change the way she saw everything. A forgotten piece of the past that would unintentionally make it clear that the pain didn't begin with that kiss, and that perhaps it could have been avoided, if only she'd had the courage to tell the truth before she betrayed him. Michael spent weeks without opening messages, answering calls, or responding to anyone. Not out of pride, but because there was nothing left to say. His silence wasn't punishment, it was mourning. And like all mourning, it hurt in waves. Sometimes it was anger, other times disbelief, and other times the silent sadness of someone who simply doesn't understand how something that seemed solid can crumble in seconds. He left the apartment for a few days and went to his mother's house, seeking some peace and a space that wasn't permeated by her scent, her belongings, her remnants in every corner. He didn't cry in front of anyone, but just being alone was enough for the tears to come as if they'd been building up for years. It wasn't just the kiss, it wasn't just the other man, it wasn't just the broken trust. It was everything it represented. The feeling of being left behind without even realizing it. The realization that he'd been alone in the relationship for much longer than he'd imagined. And even though part of him still loved her, he couldn't imagine going back. Something had definitely broken. Emma persisted. She sent long messages. He called countless times. She went to his mother's house and waited for hours on the street, until she was seen from the window and ignored. She wrote emails, letters, desperate attempts to tell him she didn't know what she was doing, that she had lost herself, that the kiss meant nothing, that if she could go back in time, but no word seemed to carry enough weight. He didn't respond. He didn't hold back, he didn't respond, he just remained silent. And this silence was more brutal than any fight. Emma then wrote by hand, crying, her handwriting trembling, saying she just wanted to be heard one last time. She asked for just one conversation. A coffee. 15 minutes. No shouting, no pressure. Just to try to explain. He, tired, hesitated. But he replied with a single sentence, tomorrow. 5 p.m. At the usual place. She arrived early. She had dark circles under her eyes, her face was tired, but her gaze still held hope. When he entered the cafe, the world seemed to stop for a moment. They didn't hug. They didn't touch. They just sat. She took a deep breath and began to speak. She told him she loved him, that she'd never stopped loving him. She told him she'd lost herself, that she'd felt invisible for months, that she carried anguish she didn't know how to share with him. She'd written a letter long ago, when she thought things could still be fixed, but hadn't had the courage to deliver it. Michael kept his eyes on her the entire time. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. He just listened. When she stopped speaking, exhausted, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a yellowed envelope. He said he found it by chance, in a forgotten box. He said he only read it because he thought it was important. When he opened it and saw it was a letter from her, he thought it was an old note, one of many she'd left around the house. But no. It was a letter never sent. Written months before. And reading it, something inside him broke with more force than the kiss itself. He began to speak. Calmly, but his voice cracked. He said that if she had given him that letter, none of this would have happened. He said that there, in the words she hid, lay the chance to save what they had. That he would have listened, would have changed, would have fought with her. But she didn't choose dialogue. She chose silence. And then, betrayal. He said the letter hurt more than the kiss. Because the kiss contained impulse, error, carelessness. But the letter contained an attempt at redemption that she stifled alone. And because of that, even though he forgave her, he couldn't stay. There was no longer any way to walk together. Emma began to cry silently, her hands trembling. He said he knew, that he regretted it every day, that the kiss was an explosion of everything she had kept bottled up out of fear. But he looked at her with an expression of such profound weariness that he seemed to be aging inside. He said he'd already started over. That he'd already found another perspective. That it wasn't about replacing someone, but about finding peace. And that Emma, even with all the love he'd had for her, now represented a story that needed to be left in the past. She lowered her head and said she understood. That she just wanted him to know the love was real. He replied that he knew. And that perhaps that was the saddest part. That the love had existed, and yet, it hadn't been enough to prevent the end. He stood, left the envelope on the table, looked at her one last time, and left. Emma stood there, alone, staring at her empty cup, the letter folded beside her, and an irreparable sense of loss. Not just of a love, but of everything that could have been if she had spoken. If she had asked for help. If she had trusted the bond instead of trying to run from it. Outside, the day was cloudy. And inside, everything was darkening too. There were no more messages, no calls, no hope of reconciliation. There was only silence and the memory of a choice. A choice made in an instant. And one that cost a lifetime. But what Emma didn't yet know, was that the man who kissed her at that party, who disappeared afterward without explanation, carried a secret that would make everything even more devastating. Something that had nothing to do with desire, passion, or love. A detail hidden in time. A missing link between past and present. A name she didn't recognize at the time, but that, when she discovered it, would reveal a truth that would change everything. Because some mistakes destroy. And there are truths that bury any possibility of redemption. And this, was about to emerge. 2 months had passed since their last meeting. Emma continued to live in a strange limbo between regret and inertia. The mornings were slow, the days dragged, the nights too long. She returned to teaching, returned to smiling mechanically at her colleagues, returned to repeating her daily routine, but the spark was no longer there. It wasn't just Michael's absence in her life that consumed her, but the profound emptiness of having destroyed something real without even understanding why. The man who had kissed her at the party had disappeared without a trace. She never saved his number, never knew his last name, never asked where he came from. He was just a face that appeared at the wrong time, with words too sweet for someone who was broken inside. She tried to look him up on social media, tried to discreetly ask the colleague who invited her to the lecture where she met him, but no one seemed to know who he was. Like a shadow that passes through someone's life only to cause chaos and then leaves before dealing with the fragments. Emma felt she needed to understand, needed to close that cycle with some logic. I needed to know, at least, why. It was on a cloudy Saturday that everything began to fall into place. She was organizing old folders on her computer, deleting files from years ago, when she came across an old, unread email, lost in a folder called Drafts. The sender was a common male name, familiar but distant. The content, a farewell message. Curious, she clicked on it. It was a letter from a former student, a sensitive boy with watchful eyes and a soft voice, who had left the school years before after his mother passed away. The letter was a thank you. It said she had been a light to him during that dark time. That her literature classes were the only thing that kept him going, that she had taught him to find meaning in words even when life made no sense at all. Emma felt her heart sink. She didn't remember the email, but she remembered the boy. He was different. Far too intelligent for his age. He always stayed after class to talk, to show his writing, to listen to advice. He had a mature look in his eyes, and there was something about him that touched her deeply. But he left without warning, and after a while, he disappeared from everyday memories. Intrigued, she searched for his name online. And there, faced with a recent photo, older, more confident, more of a man, her stomach turned. It was him. The man from the party. The same one. The same intense gaze, the same crooked smile, the same voice that now echoed in her mind almost cruelly. She felt her world spin. What did that mean? Why hadn't he said anything? Why had he approached her after so many years? Why had he chosen that exact moment in her life to reappear, and then disappear? Sudden nausea gripped her, she rose from her chair, and had to take a deep breath to keep from crying right there. Of all the people in the world, why him? It took her days to work up the courage to send a message. She wrote and deleted countless times. Finally, she sent something simple, direct, we need to talk. I figured it out. The reply came a few hours later, short but weighty, I know. Meet me at the park tomorrow at 10 a.m. She didn't sleep that night. She spent the hours remembering their conversations, the words exchanged, the shared silences, how she had felt so understood, so alive. And now, it took on a dark, uncomfortable, almost unacceptable tone. She got up early, dressed simply, tied up her hair, and left. On the way, she felt her heart race at every turn. When she saw him, sitting on the same bench where she and Michael had been so many times before, her chest tightened. He was serious, his eyes downcast, his hands clasped between his knees. She approached slowly. She sat beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Until she broke the silence with the question she needed to ask, why? He sighed deeply, looked up, and said, his voice firm but filled with an old regret, because you were everything my mother said I needed to forgive. She frowned in confusion, and he continued. My mother died hating my father. He betrayed her, abandoned us, and disappeared. She said that strong women need to break up with men who destroy them, but she also said that sometimes men make mistakes out of fear, weakness, loneliness. And that betrayal is never the end, but the reflection of something that was already broken. For a long time, I harbored anger. Anger at the abandonment, the silence, the absences. And when I left that school, I held on to everything you were to me. A kind of refuge. You didn't even know it, but you saved me. Emma shook her head, confused. That doesn't answer anything. Why did you kiss me? Why did you disappear? Why did you get involved with me now, out of the blue? He took a moment to answer. Then he pulled a small, old, yellowed photograph from his pocket and handed it to her. That's my father. She took the photo, and for a moment, the world went silent. It was Michael. Younger, darker hair, but unmistakably him. Her Michael. The love of her life. Emma's eyes widened, the photo dropped to her lap, and her hand went to her mouth, as if trying to stifle a scream. He said, I spent years not knowing who he was. My mother wouldn't tell me his name. She just said he'd left before I was born. One day, I found a letter he'd saved. I went after it. I found out everything. I discovered he was alive, married, happy. With you. I wanted to see him. Look into his eyes. Understand who the man was who chose to forget he had a son. And when I saw you at that lecture, I knew. It was you. The woman from my mother's letters. The woman from the torn photos. The woman he traded me for. Emma couldn't breathe. She tried to piece it together, tried to find air in the midst of it all. He continued. It wasn't planned. Not like this. But when I realized you were looking at me, that you felt alone, that you needed something, I gave in. I thought it would be a way to punish him. To make him feel the pain of abandonment. To show him that everything comes back. That the past takes its toll. But when I kissed you, I realized none of it was justice. It was just poorly crafted revenge. That's why I left. That's why I disappeared. Because I realized, too late, that I used you. That I toyed with the pain of two people who weren't to blame for what I lacked. Emma wept silently. Her hands trembled. Her eyes fixed on the photo. She tried to remember every detail of her life with Michael, tried to piece together the chronology, tried to understand how he never told her anything. But deep down, she knew. Michael didn't know. He couldn't know. She stood up, unable to say anything. She walked quickly, her steps unsteady, without looking back. She arrived home and spent hours in silence. Then she called the number that was still saved, even after everything. Michael answered. She asked him to come over. She said she needed to tell her something. For the first time, he didn't hesitate. When he arrived, he found a devastated Emma. Unlike any version he'd ever seen. They sat in silence. She told him everything. Unfiltered. From the email to the park. Every detail. Michael listened in absolute silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. But his expression changed with each sentence. When she finished, he closed his eyes and simply said, "I didn't know. I swear on everything. I didn't know." She nodded. "I know. I believe. But I had to tell you. Because this is our end. And I didn't want it to be with more lies." Michael stood up. He walked to the window. He was silent for minutes. Then he said, his voice breaking, "I loved you with everything I had. And maybe that's why I never forgave myself for not seeing. For not listening. For not realizing what was missing. But now I understand. Some pains aren't ours. Some stories come from before. And even without wanting to, we pay the price." Emma tried to get closer, but he backed away. He said he needed to go. That he needed to think. That he might not come back. And that this wasn't revenge. It was just the last wound he could bear. She didn't insist. She just waved. And he left. Without looking back. This time, for good. Emma stood motionless in the room even after the door closed behind him, as if the air had become too dense to move, as if everything around her had lost its sound, its smell, its color. The silence in the house was louder than any scream, more piercing than any argument, more painful than the goodbye she had just heard. The clock on the wall continued ticking away the seconds as if nothing had happened, as if life were still going on, indifferent to the collapse that had just occurred within those walls. But for her, time had stopped there. Not because of the kiss, not because of the betrayal, not because of the son she never knew he had, but because she had seen, in his eyes, the definitive end of something she believed, somewhere deep in her soul, could still be restored. There would be no second chance. There would be no new beginning. And the cruelest thing of all was that, this time, she understood. And so, she would not beg. In the days that followed, Emma tried to keep breathing. School once again became her only refuge, but even then, her outlook seemed different. There was no longer a rush to finish her plans, no sparkle when discussing classic novels, not even excitement when correcting the essays of her most talented students. Everything seemed distant, as if she were living inside a bubble that separated her pain from the real world. At night, her dreams were confusing, full of faces that merged, the boy she had taken in years ago, the man he had become, the love she had lost and that now bore an invisible scar between past and present. Everything mixed together, everything jumbled, everything imploded in a sequence of wrong decisions, of unspoken silences, of buried truths. She began to carry a double guilt, that of betrayal, yes, but also that of not having seen who that boy was, of not having asked the right questions, of having allowed herself to be drawn in without realizing how deeply she was being drawn into a story that wasn't just hers. Meanwhile, Michael didn't return to the house where they'd shared years of life. He took only what was necessary, the bare essentials to rebuild a new routine far from the traces she'd left. He moved into a modest apartment, furnished only with the bare necessities, like someone who needs to start over from scratch without the weight of the past weighing down every object. He spent his days trying to keep his mind occupied with projects at the office, but there were times when his concentration faltered, when memories came unannounced, unchecked. They weren't memories of arguments or hurt feelings, but of small moments that once seemed insignificant and now stung like tiny needles stuck in his chest, the way she looked at him when he talked about architecture, the smell of the coffee she brewed on lazy Sundays, the note left on the refrigerator door with a quote from a book she loved. Things he thought he'd have forever, but now existed only in his memory. For weeks, he avoided any conversation about the past, any dialogue that might further scratch his open wound. But inside, a conflict consumed him. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about humanity. About the strangeness of knowing she had a son, a grown man, with pain and motivations he never knew existed. The fantasy of Emma being dragged into this without understanding what she was getting into made him even more uneasy. Because, deep down, he knew there was nothing more she could do. But even so, he couldn't find peace. He couldn't accept that he had committed, even unintentionally, the same abandonment his own father had committed against him. The mere thought of having fathered someone and not being present, even out of ignorance, made everything in him scramble. Because if before the pain was only from being betrayed, now there was the pain of having been absent, of having lost years he couldn't recover, of having left scars on someone he didn't even know. It was after a long, sleepless night that she decided to do what needed to be done. She arranged a meeting with the boy. Not to demand, not to confront, but to listen. And when she saw him entering the small cafe in the city center, she noticed how similar they were. In the way he walked, the sharpness in his gaze, the way he took a deep breath before speaking. They sat across from each other. And Michael was the first to break the silence. He said he had no idea he existed. That if I had known, I would have done everything differently. He apologized, not with rehearsed words, but with a sincerity that made the other man lower his eyes. The boy, who now had a name, an identity, a presence, said he didn't know if he wanted a father. He said he'd spent his life never expecting one. But he also confessed that he needed to understand where he came from. He needed to see firsthand who the man his mother had loved and hated so much at the same time was. The conversation lasted hours. They didn't resolve everything. They didn't heal the wounds. But they opened a door. A door of possible reconciliation, not as father and son immediately, but as two men who carry the same unfinished story in their bodies. Emma learned of the meeting through a brief message sent days later. Michael simply said he had spoken to him and thanked him for telling her the truth. And that now, more than ever, he knew the past could not be undone, but the future could still be written with more honesty. There was no rancor in the words. Only a mature, resigned pain, tired of carrying the weight of what could no longer be changed. She cried as she read it. She cried because, for the first time, she felt he didn't hate her. And maybe, just maybe, that was the closest thing to peace she would get from the man who had once been everything to her. Even so, Emma didn't seek him out again. Not out of pride. But because she understood he needed to move on. And so did she. For the first time in months, she felt a different calm. A gentle acceptance, like someone who finally understands that the mistake she made was too serious to be erased, but not enough to stop her from starting over. She started going out more, looking people in the eye again, talking to students with a less sad smile. She began walking in the mornings, frequenting bookstores, rediscovering small pieces of herself that had been forgotten during the time she lived for a relationship that had already died long before its end. Little by little, she rediscovered herself. And with that, she also understood that the most important love she had lost, was self-love. Michael, on the other hand, began to allow himself to be there too. More carefully, more cautiously, more silently. He didn't seek out anyone, he didn't open up easily, but he began accepting invitations, going out with friends, and talking lightly. A coworker, who had always been around gently, approached him more firmly. She didn't ask too many questions, didn't try to take up space, she was just there. And it was this unpretentious presence that began to warm something inside him that had been frozen for too long. There was no rush. Just a new rhythm. A new perspective. A new beginning that didn't come to replace, but to show that life doesn't end in the wreckage. That sometimes love comes after war, with the calm of someone who has lost everything and now only wants peace. Time passed. It didn't erase the story, but let each person find their own path. Emma continued to carry the memories like someone carrying a scar, not to punish herself, but to remember the importance of choosing better. Michael learned to truly forgive. To forgive his son's absence, Emma's unintentional lie, and most importantly, himself. The young man who was the link between them also moved on, now with the clarity that he didn't need complete answers to move forward. The truth was enough. And the truth had finally come to light. But deep down, in a place no one else could see, a dilemma still existed. Because some stories, even closed, continue to reverberate in every gesture of the present. And on any given afternoon, when their paths cross again, something still unresolved will pulsate. Not to reopen the wound, but to show that, even in the saddest endings, there is always a choice to be made. One final choice. And this one will be definitive. Spring arrived without warning, with the first warmer rays of sunlight streaming through the windows, invading spaces that previously seemed inert, as if the season had come to announce that the world would continue, even if, for some, everything was still suspended between what was and what could have been. Emma now lived in a small one-bedroom apartment, far from the center, with bare walls and furniture purchased piecemeal, like someone building a new home with only the essentials, not out of economy, but out of emotional necessity. The excesses, the too many memories, the objects burdened by the past, everything had been left behind. She chose a space where only the present and silence would fit. A space where I could breathe without being haunted at every corner by memories that, though sweet, now carried the weight of all that had been lost. One particularly nostalgic late afternoon, Emma received an envelope with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, the content simple and direct. An invitation to the photography exhibition of the boy with whom everything had begun to fall apart. The opening would take place at a small cultural center on the other side of town on a Saturday night. The show's title was Shared Silences. For a few minutes, she held the paper between her fingers, as if it were too hot to handle. She didn't know if it was a plea for reconciliation, a provocative gesture, or simply a way to conclude, through art, the cycle they had so tragically begun. But something inside her, perhaps the part that still sought to understand, perhaps the part that had already learned to accept, pushed her there. The space was discreet, decorated with yellowish lights and the scent of old wood. Black and white photographs covered the walls with a melancholic aesthetic, charged with emotion. Partially covered faces, clasped hands, averted gazes, frozen silences in images that screamed truths no one had spoken. Emma walked among the paintings with moist eyes, feeling in each click the pain that could not be expressed in words. In the background, she saw him. Alone, in a simple shirt and a lost look in his eyes. When he saw her, he didn't smile, but neither did he shy away. He walked toward her with unexpected serenity and, after a brief silence, spoke in a more mature, less wounded voice. He said he didn't want her to come to relive anything, but because, of all people, she was part of that creative process. That, in the end, that exhibition was more about him than about either of them. About understanding the layers of unresolved feelings, about transforming pain into art, about building identity with the pieces that remain. Emma nodded, grateful there was no resentment, no pressure. She asked if he and Michael had seen each other again. He shook his head slowly and said no, but that they exchanged messages sometimes. Short, cold, almost formal words, but they were gradually creating a space of respect. He said he didn't expect them to be father and son in the romantic sense, but that just knowing he existed was a kind of redemption. And Emma understood that there was a possible beginning there. Not for her, not with her, but for him. And that, somehow, was enough. That same night, when Emma arrived home, she found a package on her doorstep. Inside was a poetry book with an antique cover, with a dedication on the back cover she knew well, Michael's handwriting. The written phrase simply read, "The pains we don't tell still define us. Take good care of yours." It was his first gesture after all this. Not a gesture of romantic rapprochement, but of silent care. And paradoxical as it was, it soothed her. She knew, in that moment, that even apart, the respect between them had endured. Perhaps because it had always been genuine. Perhaps because, deep down, true love doesn't fade, it only learns to transform. Michael, for his part, began to see the world through different eyes. He spent more time outdoors, walking, discovering new places, visiting exhibitions, absorbing everything with the renewed curiosity of someone finally allowing themselves to experience a life without constraints. His co-worker, previously just a comfortable presence, began to occupy more intimate spaces in his routine. They shared coffee before work, laughed about trivial things, exchanged confidences fearlessly. There wasn't the intensity of an overwhelming love, but there was sincerity, care, time, and that was what he sought now. Something that would come without haste, without pressure, without open wounds to heal. Someone who would arrive to walk alongside him, not to rebuild what had already been destroyed. One day, while rearranging books on his new bookshelf, Michael found an old folder filled with papers from his college days. Among them was a yellowed sheet of paper with notes from a project he never completed. He sat with it in his hands and stared at his own handwriting for minutes, as if staring at a version of himself he no longer recognizes. There was a dreamy, ambitious man there, full of plans for the future, and realizing how much of that essence still existed within him was comforting. He was still him. More hardened, more restrained, more selective. But still him. The betrayal, the revelation, the pain, none of it had turned him into a cynic. Quite the opposite. All of it had taught him that love wasn't about losing control, but about taking responsibility for how you feel, even when everything falls apart. Later, sitting on the porch, he wrote an unaddressed email. It was intended for Emma, but it wasn't meant to be sent. In it, he said he had learned to respect his own time. That he had spent months searching for answers, justice, even redemption. But what freed him was silence. The decision to stop looking for someone to blame and start looking at himself with more compassion. That, in the end, everyone makes mistakes. And that some mistakes, though unforgivable in practice, don't need to be eternally punished. Sometimes, forgiving is simply stopping the bleeding. And he had stopped. With this text, he wasn't seeking closure, it was already over, but perhaps, on some unconscious level, he still felt the need to be read by her one last time, even if only in his mind. A few weeks later, by coincidence, or not, the three met at a public event in a museum. Michael arrived with his new partner, Emma alone, the young man accompanying a group of photographers. The moment was brief, a meeting of glances, a respectful greeting, and slight smiles. No one approached more closely than necessary. No one lingered longer than necessary. But in that moment, there was a silent peace hovering between them. Not the peace of reconciliation. But the peace of someone who accepted. Of someone who walked through the rubble and still kept going. There was no more raw pain. There was memory. And from memory, understanding now emerged. Emma returned home that night with her heart filled with something new. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't longing, nor was it relief. It was something more subtle, more mature. It was the recognition that life is often about loss, and yet still choosing to believe in what might come next. She sat at her desk, opened a new notebook, and wrote, for the first time in a long time, something not to vent, but to record. The loves we lose teach us not to settle for less than we deserve. And sometimes, the price for that lesson is high. But still, it's worth it. Across town, Michael put on a record, prepared 2 glasses of wine, and smiled as he watched the woman beside him dance, clumsy but free. Life had been hard, but now it was light. Not because the traumas had been erased, but because he had chosen not to dwell on them. And that, in the end, was the true way to start over. Not waiting for the past to return. But letting it stay exactly where it belongs, behind. Time, with its relentless patience, finally pushed each of them into the places they needed to be. There were no more words stuck in their throats, no more sorrow sinking into their chests with every memory. All that remained now was what each of them had built from the moment they stopped trying to fix what had been irreparably broken. Emma, after months of silent reconstruction, found a kind of stability that no longer relied on anyone, but on herself. She taught with greater depth, not because she had regained her former lightness, but because she now carried a pain that taught her to listen better, to see beyond appearances. Her students, unbeknownst to them, began to receive more than knowledge. They received a gaze that understood, that welcomed, that recognized what no one dared to say aloud. And that, for her, was enough. Love, she understood, was not something to chase. It was something that, when true, is built through mutual effort, and, above all, through truth. And the truth, however painful it was, finally inhabited every corner of his life. One Saturday morning, while organizing her new bookshelf, Emma found the ring he'd left on her hand that night that marked the end. She'd impulsively put it away, without knowing why, as if it were just any object, but seeing it there now, cold and metallic, she understood it was the last thing still tying her to the past. She walked down to the street, walked to a bridge where she often stopped to watch the river in moments of reflection, and there, with a deep sigh, released the small gold circle into the current. It wasn't just any symbolic act, it was the true end of a cycle. An unspoken but felt full stop. A definitive goodbye to the woman she'd been, to the guilt she'd carried, and to the promises that would never be fulfilled. Michael, on the other hand, experienced his own rebirth silently, almost imperceptibly, yet powerfully. He didn't build a new story trying to fill the gaps of the previous one, but gradually built a life that made sense for who he was at that new moment. His days were now marked by calmer choices, more restrained gestures, but also by more sincere affections. The woman who now walked by his side didn't want to save anything, didn't want to fix anyone. She was simply there. And that was enough. With her, he learned to laugh again, not with the reckless enthusiasm of youth, but with the maturity of someone who has understood that life can fall apart at any moment and, therefore, must be lived with presence. The relationship with his son, in turn, was built carefully, like someone walking through a minefield, treading slowly, testing the ground. They began with brief encounters, then came more intimate exchanges, silences filled with looks that said more than words. Michael never tried to be the ideal father, it wasn't possible. But he became someone present, willing, someone who listened. And that, in the end, was more valuable than any father figure forged by obligation. One day, while visiting the boys' new exhibition, which featured images of blurred faces with poetic captions about absence and reconstruction, Michael was moved. He said nothing there, but upon leaving, he sent a simple message: "I'm proud of you. And I regret every absence I've been." The reply came quickly, few words, but loaded with meaning: "You're here now. That's enough." A year later, the three crossed paths again. Not by chance, but through a conscious gesture of reconciliation. It was the launch of a photo book by the young man, now gaining prominence in the city's cultural scene. He invited them both. Not as a test, but as a poetic closing to a chapter that needed to be closed with dignity. Emma arrived alone, dressed simply, but with clear eyes like they hadn't seen in a long time. Michael came with her, calm, serene, with a gentle but firm gaze. They greeted each other with a restrained, polite, and respectful hug. There was no more discomfort, no guilt, no hope. There was only what remained after the storm: maturity, learning, and an unwavering respect for everything they had experienced. At the end of the event, the young man thanked them both. He said that without them he wouldn't have become who he was. And that, even though everything began in chaos, the outcome was beautiful. It was whole. And perhaps that was what everyone was looking for. Not a happy ending in the romantic sense, but a true ending, where each could continue their journey without carrying the debris of the past on their shoulders. Emma walked alone, but never again felt empty. She learned that loneliness is not the absence of love, but often the fertile ground where dignity flourishes. Michael walked alongside someone who arrived without promising anything, but stayed for everything he built. And the boy, the product of a hidden past, became the link connecting two stories that seemed destined for failure, but found redemption through the truth. Nothing went as planned. Nothing was perfect. But everything was real. And, therefore, it was enough. If you've made it this far, leave a comment. What did you think of this story? What would you have done differently? Which character touched you the most? Your opinion is very important, and we'd love to hear how this story resonated with you. So comment below and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because here, each story is designed to move you, challenge you, and make you think. And speaking of which, this story teaches a clear lesson: betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship, it destroys respect, trust, plans, and sometimes even the people who should never have been affected by it. When someone chooses to betray, they don't just choose a moment of pleasure or escape, but they open a hole that's hard to close, a hole that drags feelings, stories, entire families. And when everything falls apart, it's often too late to rebuild what was lost. So think carefully before crossing a line of no return. Loyalty, truth, and presence remain the strongest pillars of love. This channel does not support, encourage, or romanticize any type of cheating. The stories told here are fictional, but the feelings are real. And our commitment is to use these narratives to show that cheating isn't just any mistake, it's a choice that, almost always, costs a significant amount. Until the next story.